Okay, well, welcome everyone who's here and there, and those who join us later
We
as
believe
well.
in perfect faith that there will be people watching this.
Yes, and assuming, including those who submitted a couple of these questions, who I don't see on the screen in front of us. But we will get to those. Anyhow, having said that, let's go ahead and talk to God and get this thing launched now that we've got everything set up here, both by way of Hebrew resources and biblical resources and technological resources.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Father, for this opportunity that we have to be together, to just interact with some stuff that's come up in people's lives and their thinking and their reading or wherever else, and the questions it might have raised. Enable us to, first of all, understand the questions clearly, then to be able to answer them accurately and effectively. And Lord, so we're asking for good communication to take place, but not just good communication, but understanding on our parts as we're trying to answer the questions, but on the parts of those who are trying to make sense of the answers we're trying to give. Thank you that you're interested in us and in this whole process, and thank you that you stepped into our history to make us part of your process, your relation, and have a relationship with you. For this we're grateful, because of Yeshua our Messiah. Amen. Okay.
Oh, this is my daughter's book.
Yes.
It has writing in it. I wonder why she had this. Did I start? I could have started teaching out of this book when she was a teenager. That's why it has her letters in it.
For those of you who are listening in and
Never
wondering
mind.
what that conversation was all about, Patrice was looking at some of the Hebrew resources that this is a commercial, that the summer sessions of first year Hebrew will be looking into in preparation for second year Hebrew. So that's all part of the seminary and yeshiva courses. I will be perhaps giving yet another commercial for semester courses starting in the fall, but we'll see how the questions play out. Okay. All right. The question is this. I recently discovered that there is a third heaven. We are in the first heaven. The skies in outer space are in the second. And above that is the third, where God resides. Is this all true? Is this reliable? Well, in a second, I'm going to take a look at the NIV Study Bible, and it's got a very interesting note along that line, and the note very much lines up with the way in which this question was phrased. However, here's what you need to understand on a couple fronts. One of the Second Temple literature books are the books of Enoch, First and Second Enoch. Now, in Second Enoch, as it turns out, in Second Enoch, and again, this is late Second Temple period or just post Second Temple period, talks in terms of 10 heavens. If you look through the whole realm of vast Jewish material, and the reason I mentioned Second Enoch, it's roughly contemporary with the text from which the third heaven comes from, which is 2 Corinthians 12. At least it's well within about half a century of the writing of that. So, 10 heavens in 2 Enoch. Throughout the scope of Jewish literature, you will find, and I'm trying to remember how many in mystical Judaism, in Kabbalah, Kabbalistic Judaism. I'm not sure how many there are there. There may be 10 there as well, but I'd have to double check that. But anyhow, the vast scope of Jewish literature, you find anywhere from, 3 heavens to 365 heavens. Now, I don't know if the 365 was for one day, one heaven for each day of the year. Who knows?
Did they have the idea of 365 days a year?
Well, yes, they did, at least to some degree, because it's reflected, and that's a good question. And as you raised that question, I was thinking, did they know this? Yes, because remember you had 3 different calendars, and we've talked about this in a number of contexts before, religious calendars, besides the Roman calendar in the time period of the Second Temple. You had, basically the temple calendar had 2 variations, a Pharisaic version and a Sadducean version, not surprising at all. And that became the basis for the Jewish calendar we observe. Now, the Jewish calendar that we observe is aware of what we would call the solar year because of something we're experiencing this year, which is what? It's a leap year. And in the Jewish calendar, leap year doesn't add 1 day, as does the more generally used calendar. It adds 1 month. Now, the Essene calendar of the Second Temple period was basically a solar calendar, and it was, although maybe, let me take that back a second. The Essene calendar, was closer to a solar calendar. It ran on a 664-day year. And then they would make adjustments. So obviously they were aware of 365 days roughly, because remember, it's 365 and a fraction days that are in the solar calendar, which is why we end up with our leap years. So all that to be said is that they did have some understanding of 365.
Okay.
So, and my first thought was, like I said, is it possible there's a heaven for every day? Now, if you want to do a midrash on that particular subject, let me just do a quick midrash. If there are truly 365 heavens, then we should be able to experience heaven in some way every day. Will that work?
No comment.
Okay. I thought it might fly. Now, 2 Corinthians 12, which I think underlies the core of the question. It's because a rabbi from this time period described an experience he had as best as he could describe it, or as best as he could describe it or articulate it. He said, in a broader context, I know a man in the Messiah who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. In this context, the likelihood is he's reflecting on his own personal experience. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. In other words, he doesn't know if it was a physical experience or if it was some sort of a, shall we call it in the rough sense, psychological kind of experience. And he wasn't sure which it was. And then he would say, God knows. And this person was caught up to paradise. So he's identifying paradise as the third heaven. He heard inexpressible things that a person is not permitted to tell. And then that's about all that he says. So we have one connector here in the context, and that is what he's describing, whether you want to call it the third heaven or you want to call it paradise, is some sort of a extraterrestrial, in the very loose but not sci-fi context, an extraterrestrial experience. He did not get beamed up by Scotty or anybody else and then got shown around the spaceship. He was just describing some sort of experience that he had, and he relates it to paradise. Now, here's the note that the NIV Study Bible has on this, and I think it's a helpful note. First thing it does is it connects the fact that third heaven and paradise are literally or contextually connected here. Paul is sure of this remarkable experience, but he's unsure whether this rapture, and that's using the Greek term very specifically, meaning caught up, was one that included the body or one that took place in separation from the body. Okay, the third heaven designates a place beyond the immediate heaven of the Earth's atmosphere and beyond the further heaven of outer space and its constellations. All right, that's very similar to what the questioner, the way in which the questioner phrased the question. And in that case, correct. The skies, and then what's beyond the skies, the greater sense of outer space, or what we might call the universe, and then the place where God resides. Okay, thus the risen, and this is part of the reason why I'm reading this, because Tuesday is Yom HaAliyah, as it would occur in the Jewish calendar. We did a preliminary celebration of that last night, and by that I'm reminding you that that is the Hebrew for Ascension Day. Ascension Day on the Christian calendar occurred a couple weeks ago, but since we operate on a Jewish calendar, that would have taken, the day of Yeshua's ascension would have taken place on the Jewish calendar as of this coming Tuesday. And then another quick aside, in case some other people didn't hear the explanation last night during the service, there is a Yom HaAliyah in the Jewish calendar. Well, let me change that. There has been a Yom HaAliyah in the Jewish calendar since 2016, but not before. In 2016...
What? Go ahead.
In 2016, the larger Jewish world, particularly Israel, instituted a special holiday called Yom HaAliyah. It was to set aside a day of celebration for... let me back it up. The day of celebration was set aside based on the day that... back it up. Based on the understanding of the day when the Jewish people were first entered Israel after the Exodus. So in that sense, it has an Exodus connection.
You mean 40 years?
Yes.
After they had wandered for 38 and a half years. Gotcha.
Exactly. So it was connected with that. It was also because of the term Aliyah refers to not only being called forward or called up to read from the Torah, as Jenny and I both did this past Friday. Aliyah also refers to those who have gone up to Israel. And the reason for that term, Aliyah, is whenever you go to Jerusalem from anywhere else in the land,
You go up.
there's only one way to get to Jerusalem. It's by going up.
And conversely, when you leave, you go down.
So,
Seriously, and Israelis who leave to go live like in California and other places, they're called based on the verb to go down.
so this was to commemorate all those who came to Israel after 1948 because they, what's the English term? Not committed Aliyah, they
Made.
made Aliyah.
Yeah.
So that's the Yom HaAliyah that started in 2016. We and a couple other Messianic congregations had been observing Yeshua's ascension for quite a few years before then. So they stole our name. So, but we decided to continue to keep calling it Yom HaAliyah when we, in fact, celebrate or observe the Yeshua's ascension. All that's to now set this next part of the description. Thus, the risen and glorified Lord is said to have passed through the heavens. Hebrews 4:14. Now, I'm going to interrupt this note on several occasions, so bear with me. What you have in the Greek is a literal translation of the Hebrew understanding of heaven. Because in Hebrew, it is not heaven, but it is in fact the plural. Heavens, as in God created the.
Heavens. Yeah.
So, and this shouldn't surprise you that in the book of Hebrews, you would have some Hebrew reflections in there, but you find this throughout the Greek of the Newer Testament, not just in Hebrews. Okay, so he ascended through the heavens, or ascended through heaven. depending on what the author there is trying to communicate for us. All right. And, now quoting Ephesians 4, having ascended higher than all the heavens, to be exalted above the heavens, Hebrews 7:26. So his ascension had to do with following his resurrection, obviously a number of days later. He then ascended into heaven, or the heavens, and higher than the heavens, exalted above the heavens. These phrases are intended to give us some idea of his status. As I remind you from time to time on a Friday night, when we do Ha-Elohim Asher, Hebrews 1, 1-3, Yeshua, as the risen, ascended Messiah, sits in the heavenly realms at the right hand of God. This particular posture, the ancient rabbis anticipated the Messiah would take. In other words, he would sit above the heavenly realms at the right hand, or the place of authority, as the right hand is understood, in the heavenly realms. Okay, so all of that by way of background to where this place is that is being described in the note. Now, to get more contextual to Hebrew, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, the note then goes on to say, the term paradise is synonymous with the third heaven, where those believers who have died are even now at home with the Lord, quoting 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 8, and Philippians 1:23. The name of the expressible things that Paul heard remains unknown to us because this is something Paul was not permitted to tell. It was an experience that must have given incalculable strength to his apostleship, which involved him in such constant and extreme suffering. Moreover, as this experience was not self-induced, it afforded him no room for self-glorification or for boasting. So that's the whole of the note for this particular expression. Is this the final word on how many heavens there are? No. Rav Shaul here is simply using at least one of the common understandings of that time period to communicate some kind of an incommunicable kind of experience that he had. Could he have said the 365th heaven? Yeah. Could he have said the 10th heaven? Yes. Could he have said the 7th heaven? Yes, but he said the third heaven. Because my guess is that since he was writing to the people of Corinth, the people of Corinth would have been familiar with this particular conceptualization or breakdown of what they understood, the expanse of the universe and beyond, as it relates, what they understood it to be in relationship to God. The bottom line here is, all he's trying to say is, he found himself in the very presence of God, and had this amazing experience. I would like to add, based on the note that's here and on where we are in the calendar, the fact that Yeshua entered that same space, having gone through what we described as the earthly and heavenly realms, where much of Satan's authority seems to be resident. Even the forces of Satan could not keep him immobilized or bound to earth. He, as the book of Ephesians suggested, and in the drash I gave a couple weeks ago, I mentioned this, he shot up through their very realms and established himself as the highest authority over them, which is what the larger version of this understanding of the heavens reminds us of. It's the place of ultimate authority where God is seated, and it in fact builds on the concept of Daniel chapter 7, where the one called the Son of Man comes and sits next to sits on the throne next to God, and there he's given ultimate or all authority and dominion in the Daniel passage. So hopefully I've weaved the threads together fairly clearly enough so that you understand what's going on in some of the background. So, any questions out here? Anything for clarification? All right. Betty, any from you since you're...
Well, I loved your explanation, but I'm I'm a visual person, and I like mentally put myself on an elevator. I went up to the first heaven, then I went up to the second heaven, but I never got to the third heaven because you don't know where it starts, and you don't see a sign, "Welcome to the third heaven." Mm-hmm. It's really hard to visualize, or
Yes.
it's just,
exactly.
it's just. I mean, you have to take so many things on faith. I know it's there, but and I don't know why. I've been in Bible studies for 60 years, and I never ran into this, and I just thought it was so weird.
Yeah. And again, remember the main point is it's to take us beyond what he's saying is, and what these understandings indicate, regardless of which number of heavens you're working from, is that there is something that you can see that's right around you, which is sort of immediate. There's something beyond that, which we would call outer space. And if you understand the physics or the astrophysics of it all, in some sense there's something even beyond all that. He's taking us to a realm that we can't really visualize, and the intention is it's above and beyond what we can imagine and visualize.
Well, thank you.
You betcha. And let's take the message out of it for us, the application out of it for us, and that's where we're going to get to be, because the note did quote or cite 2 Corinthians 5:8, and that's where Rav Shaul says that he expects when he dies to be, again, in this sense, caught up and to be present with God, above and beyond all that we can see. So we have that same hope for ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Do you have anything further on that? Okay.
Well, just the reflection that Shemayim in Hebrew is plural, just like Mayim is plural, and the relationship between water and the heavens isn't obvious until you look up and you see the blue sky. Why is the sky blue? Because of the water molecules that are in it. And so it would make sense that if Mayim is plural, and it is, and it's treated as a plural grammatically, in other words, in Hebrew, as with all languages that have this framework, if the noun is plural, then all the adjectives that describe the noun have to also be plural. We don't see that reflected in our language, but it really relates, if you're reading in Hebrew, the skies with the heavens. And that's why they're usually plural, even in a lot of English translations, even though in good English we would not say sky is plural. Just like in the story of Noah and the ark, it's usually translated many waters came and enveloped the earth or something like that. We would say a lot of water, not anything plural, but in good Hebrew. And then I think the mistaken idea is if we are going to translate good Hebrew, or the Hebrew that we see here, into good English, just say a lot of water or much water instead of many waters, because that doesn't make, unless you went in a store and you saw different bottles of water from all over the world, and then you would say many waters. But that is so weird and strange, because water in and of itself is just one whole thing, no matter what form you find it in. Does that make sense?
Yep.
It's sort of like how the English doesn't reflect Hebrew in this specific way.
And I think there's sort of an underlying correct me if I'm wrong here, underlying secondary kind of thing, in that the Hebrew does this to communicate to us the expansiveness of these
Sure.
of these particular, for lack of a better term, bodies of material. Yeah.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, is there a meaning difference between saying many waters covered the earth or water covered the earth? In English, it isn't any. There isn't any real difference. It's saying the same thing. So it's just a choice in translation, and I would maintain modern English. You don't need the many waters thing. Just say water, a lot of water, or a boatload of water. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Oh my gosh, this is even more.
Okay. Before we get to that, I was reminded of something.
Yeah.
I forget which of the Psalms it occurs in. As the heavens are above the earth, so far has He removed our sins or our transgressions from us. As far as the east is from the west, I think it's in one of the one teens, but whatever. The concept of the immenseness communicated by the plural, at least in perhaps in that secondary sense, is reinforced by that particular imagery that you find in the psalm. There, the psalmist and God through the psalmist is describing just how far away God has removed our sins from us. Because as I play with this whenever we mention it in class, if I were to ask you the question, how high are the heavens above the earth? I mean, you could come up with some sort of a quick number, but as soon as you mention that number would be incorrect, because the universe is constantly expanding. And those
You mean in reality?
In reality. And the psalmist, and obviously God behind the psalmist, at least at some level understood that, or communicated that reality, in that it isn't just so high, but it's even more than that. So He's completely removed our sins from us.
Well,
Go ahead.
no, go ahead. I want to.
Okay, I was going to say, and I think it's in Jeremiah, in the often described New Covenant passage, which is actually a renewed covenant. God said, "I will remember their sins and their transgressions no more." You know, it's completely wiped out, and the imagery of the heavens just reinforces that. Go ahead.
I can't remember what it was now. It just was a fleeting thought.
Oh,
Sorry. Specifically, as far as the east is from the west, that is like you can fly to the east and keep flying to the east, and you'll hit the date line where you change. But you can fly to the west and go over the date line. It seems to be much quicker than going to the east. But the whole thing is just a metaphor.
It's a metaphor.
Because you can't divide, because of that, you can't divide something circular into east and west, other than to tell what direction to go in. There is no boundary line
Yeah.
that works.
Although interesting, building on what you said, if you start traveling east or start traveling west, you will never eventually start traveling the other direction unless
Correct.
you turn around.
Correct.
But if you travel north, or south, there will come a point in time where the directions will be reversed.
Correct.
And remember, the psalmist said, not as far as the north is from the south, but as far as the east is from the west. Okay, we sort of traveled the globe on that one, didn't we?
There is no horse too dead to beat.
Okay. All right. Here's the question. And I'm not sure I understand the total intent of the question.
The minute I see the first word on the page, I'm just going,
Okay. Questioner asks, Melchizedek, Yeshua is a high priest by the order of Melchizedek. This is mentioned in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 17. It is, however, initially mentioned in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 20, and it's building on an argument that begins in the beginning of Hebrews chapter 5. And let's see what specifically 17 says. For it is declared, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. That's the way it's usually pronounced. That's Psalm 110:4. There are about 6 different directions to go from there, but what?
Either east or west, or
Yeah, in this case, it could be east or west rather than north or south. Let me continue with the question. The Aaronic priesthood is from the tribe of Levi, or Levi. Yeshua is not a Levite. Melchizedek, let me pronounce it the Hebrew way. Melchizedek predates Moses by centuries. What does this imply regarding Jewish law, as Moses wrote the commandments and the other 600 laws? Okay, let me peel it off backwards. Moses did not write the 600 laws. First of all, there's 613. The 613 refer to all of the guidelines or prescriptions found not in the Torah, but in the Torah extended, or the Tanakh. Okay? So, 613. I'm not sure what the question means as what does this imply regarding Jewish law, so let me give it a crack and then you can give it a crack. First of all, since it's derived from the book of Hebrews in chapters 5 through 7 is trying to show how Yeshua qualifies as a priest, because it starts out by talking all the way back in chapter 4, the end of the last paragraph. Therefore, we have a great high priest who's gone through the heavens, Yeshua the Son, Yeshua, God the Son. Let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way like we are, yet without sin. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we might receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Okay, notice again, this gets us back to the question about the heavens. This is the text that was cited, 4:14. He's gone through the heavens. And let's just see if this has a note here on heavens. Oh, interesting. I hadn't thought of this as often as I've taught the book of Hebrews. The guy the gal who's making a note here says,
it's a guy.
I wasn't going to go there. Says what you've got is a visual image that's trying to be presented to you. As the ancient high priest would disappear from the vision of those who were watching him when he went into the temple, so now, by way of metaphor analogy, Yeshua is described as disappearing from our view as he goes into, the temple.
The Holy of Holies.
In this case, the temple on high. The way in which he did that is because of his ascension. All right, so that's what sets this up. And he says, just as the high priest of those days did the kind of things that enabled people to come to God, so this high priest, Yeshua, did stuff that enables people to come to God. So he says, let us come before God then confidently. And then he gets off into a discussion where he points out how every high priest is selected from among men. It's appointed to them to represent them in matters related to God. And he talks about how this honor comes about through all of chapter 5, and it comes through the Aaronic line. And then in verse 5, he says, so the Messiah did not take upon himself the glory of becoming a high priest. In other words, he did not take it on himself. But God said to him, you are my son. I have become your father. That's Psalm 2. And then he attaches, and he says in another place, oh, by the way, for those of you who have difficulty quoting, not so much, citing the reference of passages that you quote, take heart. The author of the book of Hebrews, the author of a passage of Scripture, says, oh, by the way, in another place, the other place happens to be Psalm 110. He says, you're a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And then he goes on to say, while he was on earth, Yeshua did not act as priest. Why did he not act as priest? Because he had not yet ascended, to build on that imagery again, into the temple where the priest would function. And then in chapter 6, it's a very interesting discussion that goes on there that we're not going to get into. It says, if you're having trouble understanding these things, that's because it's time you move on from the basics of the faith that you have to some of the more complex realities or concepts that are part of it. So he says, move from milk to meat. That's the imagery he uses. And then he issues a warning while he's there. Then he comes back to this. Building on the promises made to Abraham, God said that he was going to do what he promised to Abraham, and then he concludes, we have this certainty because we have a twofold anchor, so we can be encouraged, and it's firm and secure, and it enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain, where Yeshua, who went before us, has entered on our behalf, and therefore, he says, he's become a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And then there continues an extended discussion of Melchizedek and how Melchizedek was greater than their father Abraham, because Abraham, rather than Melchizedek bowing to Abraham, in effect Abraham bowed to God because he gave him tithes. And then the argument's completed in a typical Jewish fashion of that particular day. He says, okay, if Abraham gave tithes to Melchizedek, then in some sense Melchizedek is viewed as higher than Abraham. In the same sense, because by the two psalms that the author has assigned now to Yeshua, as he being the one that is ultimately in view here, as the ultimate seed of David, because both those texts were addressed to David and to David's descendants according to a whole other set of promises of God. He then makes the argument that obviously Yeshua was from Judah, not from Levi, so he couldn't have been a priest in the normal sense. However, because he is described as from the order of Melchizedek, it's a greater priesthood, and here's why it's a greater priesthood. Because Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. What does it mean? Well, it says, let me tell you what that means. Aaron was a direct descendant of Abraham, right? Mm-hmm. From the tribe of Levi. And if Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek, he explains, in, again, typical Jewish fashion of that time period, it was as if Levi, or Levi, being, it says in the loins of Abraham, this is a physical term that means being a descendant of Abraham, having Abraham's
DNA.
direct DNA. It's as if Levi was also presenting an offering to Melchizedek. Okay? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the Western way of thinking, makes all the sense in the world in the Near Eastern way of thinking. And I got to my commercial. I will be teaching the Gospels course in the fall, and we'll spend a couple hours discussing the differences between Hellenistic and Semitic worldviews that will make a whole lot more sense out of this. But that's the way in which the author is arguing here. So he says, because you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek, Aaron paid tithes to you, and his line then is a lesser line than Melchizedek, because they were the ones paying the tithes, and the line of Melchizedek was receiving the tithes. That's the argument that occurs here. It's to establish Yeshua's qualifications to, one, enter the temple on high, and to serve as our priest or high priest, because he is a high priest of a higher order than the order of Aaron and Levi. Okay, does that make some sense? Yes, there's a question. I see that question.
It's not a question, so if people have questions, they should ask them.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, so I asked this question when I was fairly a new believer. How can Yeshua be a priest when he is not from the tribe of Levi? As a matter of fact, to further delineate, not all Levites were technically priests,
Right.
at least not in the beginning, this is all, remember when Moses is receiving this information from the Lord, this is all hypothetical because they hadn't built the temple yet. They hadn't even gotten to where they're going to build the temple yet. After they get to the land, they're not going to build the temple for how many years? A lot. But the point would be this. When you have the time, Jerusalem fell to Babylon, and then they came back during that restoration, and what's called the intertestamental period takes place. In other words, Jerusalem and the temple during later Greek and early Roman times may have not run exactly the way it was predicted in Moses's concepts that are delivered in the text. In other words, by the time you get to the intertestamental period and you have the story of the Maccabees, remember, became the kings of England, or not England, kings of let's say Israel, but especially Jerusalem. And I think they were permitted to enter the temple and conduct affairs. The Maccabee kings, the ones that came along in their line. And so the idea that Yeshua could be prophet and priest and king, which is something I think many Christians understand because it's in a couple different Christian hymns, that Yeshua is prophet, priest, and king. And that's where I think my initial question came from. Well, how can he be a priest if he's not from Levi? Well, first of all, not all Levites could even do technically what it talks about in the Torah. But that by the time you get to the Hasmonean kings, that the king had considerable amount of power, even in the Temple Mount, and could go and I think even be in charge of the whole sacrifice system. In other words, somebody's got to be in charge when you have a system built of many departments and many responsibilities. It's helpful when one thing or one group is in charge, and so it was the Hasmonean king. So that dividing line between priest and king sort of mushed all together, and people were just merely recognizing not so much that we have to check the DNA of the priest who's now in charge of this particular sacrifice today, but that it's being overseen by the king, who has by that time become the most important part of their whole system, even though a king really is not mentioned in Moses' writings almost ever. So it's a little more loosey-goosey than those who would just hop right from Exodus right to Hebrews. Let's not be doing that, It's not that abrupt and not that easy. And I think that we point to these things as, well, I would just say this. Those people who love to find mistakes and discrepancies in the Older Testament as compared to what happened in the Newer Testament, they will go looking for things like that and see, so therefore all this stuff that was told us is, mistaken and wrong and goofy, and why should we listen to it? Now we should listen to the revelation today. Would be better than the revelation that Moses had. So that just made me feel all better about this supposed discrepancy of, how can this happen? Oh no. Like it's going to take away Yeshua's distinctiveness or his ability to do things that he thought were important to do. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I'm going to build on that because it reminded me of something as you were talking. Back to the Maccabees. You know that the Maccabees, Papa plus 5 sons, were absolutely instrumental in restoring Jerusalem and the temple to a Jewish faith, heritage, and connection with God. Four of the Maccabee, Papa died of old age. Four of the Maccabee brothers died as part of the fighting, and the fighting that continued afterwards. His only surviving son was the oldest son, Simon. And what Simon did in order to try to make order out of things after they kicked out the the Syrians, he how should I put it? Proclaimed himself as king and high priest. Now, he qualified for neither. He was not of a tribe of Judah. He was a tribe of Levi, but he wasn't part of the high priestly line. But in order to provide some sense of order, he proclaimed himself king and high priest. However, in all wisdom, he said temporarily. The problem came when his son, John Hyrcanus, decided to make that permanent because he liked, how should I put it? He liked the position in which it put him in. And that started a whole realm of intrigue and corruption that eventually got so bad that Rome put an end to it because it was becoming problematic as the Roman Empire was establishing itself in the century or so afterwards. And prior to Rome finally stepping in, varying competing members who wanted to be high priest and or king would try to bribe Rome to stand behind them so they would have Roman forces behind them so they could impose their rule on the people. And this got really yucky and messy, and it's part of the reason that the group of people known as the Essenes retreated from the Jerusalem scene, so to speak, and that in all likelihood there were the early Essenes probably included some from among those who were later called the Sadducees or from the priestly family, because they saw how bad this whole situation was, and they decided to withdraw until the Messiah would come and sort things out. Well, Rome sorted it out in the year 63, and by taking over the land and then selecting the appropriate leaders. Eventually, Herod comes along in the year 37. They make him king. There's a separate high priest, and there's some sort of an order that's set up that, unfortunately, neither person fulfilled the obligations. So all of that is by way of background. Now, another thing by way of background is there's every likelihood that the book of Hebrews was written to people who had perhaps an Essene background, or at least Essene-based knowledge, because of the way in which this particular book is structured. And so you could see why the author of the book of Hebrews would now argue for Yeshua being not only the Messiah, in other words, from Judah. Please remember, anytime you read the term Christ in the English, it's the term Messiah. And every time you think in terms of the Messiah, you've got to remember who the Messiah is. The Messiah is the greatest descendant of David. He's from Judah. Okay, so how do we then get him into the priesthood? Well, we don't have to worry about that, because God, through the psalmist back in Psalm 110, already said, you were a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And so the author of the book of Hebrews now argues how that takes place and how that works. And therefore, Yeshua can be both king and priest, as Patrice mentioned.
Yeah, by the time Hebrews was written, that ship had already sailed. As far as we're going to now trace the lineage of these actual people who were in charge of the sacrifice system at the temple. Yeah, that ship had sailed.
All right. Now, king and priest, where did this idea of the two being combined come about? Yes, or come from? Well, I'm glad you asked, and here's Zechariah's answer. The word of the Lord came to me, this is 6:9. take silver and gold and so forth, go the same day to the house of Josiah, son of Zephaniah. Take the silver and gold and set it on the head of the high priest Joshua. I love that. The resident high priest at that time had the name what?
Yeshua.
Or Yeshua, to shorten it. Exactly. So, all that's, again, the people who read the book of Hebrews, or heard the book of Hebrews, because it's probably read aloud first, as soon as they talked in terms of Yeshua being called the high priest, right away, they would have thought back to, there we go, they would have thought back to Zechariah 6 and said, yes, we know Yeshua the high priest. Set the crown on the, wait a second, do you know of any high priest that ever was crowned in all of Jewish history? No, kings are crowned. Okay, just keep that in mind. Tell him this is what the Lord Almighty says. Here is the man whose name is the branch. Branch in the prophetic texts became a title of the messianic era of David's line. And it is also part of the prayers for Sukkot. The prayers are addressed to the one who's known as the branch, namely the Messiah. But this is in Sukkot. We haven't even made it to Shavuot, so we'll do Sukkot later. Okay, set it on the head of the high priest. Here's the man whose name is the branch. It is he who will build the temple of the Lord. He will be clothed with majesty and will sit and rule on his throne. Whoa. What priest ever rules on a throne? In fact, in the biblical text, what priest ever sits? The priest is always in motion, standing. So you'll see, if you're hearing this and visualizing this, the imagery should be coming together as a combination of king and priest, both with the crown, both with the sitting on the throne, and yet he's been called the high priest. He will be, and then he says, he will rule and sit on his throne, and he will be a priest on his throne, and there will be harmony between the two. In other words, the two are brought together.
There they are.
There it is. And then it continues on from there. So this idea of a combination king and priest is already in the prophetic text, or at least in Zechariah, and there is every likelihood that Simon the Maccabee was aware of this as well, and so did not feel it particularly inappropriate to, at least for the time being, as he said, take on this role.
Those of us with the benefit of hindsight can put our finger on the text and go, yeah, but right here it said this. Well, that may not be what they were experiencing at his time period. And I think we need to allow that to shape our minds.
So, the author of the book of Hebrews continues that argument, tries to bring that argument to its conclusion. He is not only the king, the Messiah, he is also the high priest who can now function on our behalf in the heavenly temple, so we can come freely into the heavenly temple and come before God there. Now, I'm going to do a little bit of a tangent here because it is somewhat connected and people get it all screwed up. Often in both Christian and in Messianic Jewish circles, we're told, yes, because of the book of Hebrews and other texts, that we get to that, and because the veil in the temple was torn, we now get to go into the Holy of Holies and serve God there. If you make that statement, then what you have effectively said is that you have not become a priest, you've become a high priest. And the book of Hebrews is very clear and says there's only one high priest, and that's Yeshua. So guess what? We don't get to go into the Holy of Holies, so to speak. We only get to go into the holy place where the other priests got to go in. Well, what about the temple being torn down? The temple curtain being torn down. There are two curtains or veils in the temple from its inception to its constitution, or from the inception of the tabernacle to its reconstitution as temple. There's the outer curtain and the inner curtain. The outer curtain is the one that allows priests to go into the holy place. The inner curtain is the one through which the high priest goes. The curtain that was torn down was the outer curtain. How do we know? Two reasons. The way in which it's described matches up to the way in which Josephus describes the outer curtain. And by the way, the imagery is that of the heavens. Interesting enough to come full circle in our discussion for this evening. Number two, if the inner curtain had been torn, who would have known that? No one, because no one could have seen it. But for it to be a demonstration of something having taken place, it had to be the outer curtain. Fair enough?
Which I'm just going to highlight one thing, which is really important. The whole translation with the word veil, like V-E-I-L, is so wrong in modern life, because a veil in modern life is very flimsy, see-through fabric that a bride wears over her face, but she can see through it great. Whereas what is being denoted is a tapestry, a very thick, heavy tapestry that generations of insects cannot eat through. So it's really important to have the metaphor in mind, that is the metaphor being delivered to us, not what the I think it's an old translation that is just maintained its way. And then it becomes theologically relevant because, a veil, you could see through that. And so we can see into the Holy of Holies. I could make a whole sermon out of this misunderstanding of the word veil. And it sounds pretty good, but it's not really based in accurate ideas, because that was a tapestry probably as thick as the curtains that are drawn closed in a big auditorium. You can't see through that on purpose. It has layers upon layers, and it's also fireproof. So this idea of a veil, this flimsy little piece of material that I could rip apart on a good day, is not an accurate viewpoint of what is being discussed and what got ripped when Yeshua was in the process of his death.
Okay, now, I'm going to try to make sense of the last part of this question. Before I do, let me set the stage, because this will help me answer the last part of what was sent in. There are people who think, and there are some even in Messianic circles, or pseudo-Messianic circles, who think that because Yeshua is the great high priest after the order of Melchizedek, therefore the other priesthood got set aside. No. How do we know? Because all of the apostles, and especially Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, continued to offer sacrifices in the temple, and in order to do so, they had to interact with the priesthood. And in fact, Acts chapter 27, verse 9, if I remember correctly, we were told that Rav Shaul observed the fast, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. And if he did that, then he, how should we put it, recognized the role and authority of the high priest. So the high priest and the Aaronic priesthood was not set aside by the order of Melchizedek. This whole argument is simply to show that it is a higher priesthood that Yeshua entered. He did not eliminate the lower priesthood, to use the imagery that's there. They continued side by side. And in fact, that priesthood would continue, because in Ezekiel, and it's reflected on in the book of Revelation, there will be a third temple. And if there's going to be a third temple in which sacrifices take place, guess what we're going to need? Priests. And let me say it again in case you missed it the first time through. The rabbi, Rav Shaul, offered sacrifices in the temple after Yeshua's resurrection and ascension. It continued. It was still in place and intact, and to be recognized and reverenced. Okay,
I just wanted to put a little note on that.
yes.
So in one of my very first classes in seminary, it was a missions class, so I'm not sure how this topic came up. it was a group of about 10 of us were sitting around a single table. It wasn't a giant lecture hall. It was a group of about 10 of us. And the guy who was up near the front, and I'm at the other end. And so this gets brought up that Rav Shaul took a sacrifice to the temple, and it was fine to Rav Shaul. And so one of the guys, a student like me, said, "Wow, Rav Shaul made a big mistake there. He totally misunderstood what he should be doing." And then the whole class went silent. And I forget who it could have been. The professor said, "If we start claiming that Rav Shaul made mistakes and taught us wrong things, there's no end to that problem. There is no end if you start going down that road." And then the guy who had said it originally went, "Huh." And I'm going, "Uh-huh."
That's a wonderful example of what is often done, whereby people, and by this I mean Christians, both Catholics and Protestants and all the variations, and Messianic Jews, have a tendency to read their theology into the text rather than deriving their theology from the text. And oh, by the way, considering this example that Patrice just mentioned, which is an excellent example from Acts 26. 26? No. 21. Verse 26 and following. I knew there was a 26 in there someplace. Anyhow, Rav Shaul does this not on his own initiative, but at the recommendation of Yeshua's brother James, who represented the whole of the apostolic community.
Who also made a mistake?
That's where I was going to. Therefore, the head of the apostolic community and all the other apostles made the very same mistake. And now if you're going to throw out all they did because of mistakes they made, we are left with Older Testament and nothing more.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay. Now, the questioner goes on to say, Psalm 133:1 indicates we are all brothers and sisters even if there are different priestly lineages between Moses and Melchizedek. Two things. It's good for brothers and sisters to dwell together in unity, is what Psalm 133 verse 1 says. So the questioner is applying that to what seems to be implied within the question of some sort of a hostility or antipathy or difference at a foundational level between Moses and Melchizedek. There isn't, because under the order of Melchizedek, as I laid the groundwork for you, and as Patrice reinforced with that example, the priesthood continued. There is no conflict. The author of Hebrews simply shows how the two are integrated, and therefore how Yeshua is qualified to fulfill the Psalm 110 prophecy and ultimately the anticipation of Zechariah chapter 6. No conflict between the priestly line through Aaron and the order of Melchizedek and Yeshua as a high priest. And therefore, as he says, as the questioner says, rightly so, we must live in peace together as brothers and sisters do. Because after all, these did as well. And as Psalm 133 verse 1 says, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. All right. Should we stop here or continue to another question?
I don't know. It depends on how long the question is. Do we have any?
No. First of all, yes. Are there any questions from those of you who are either here in the room or those of you who are on the screen, or either related to what we've covered or just has come to mind? Thank you. We forgot to give that priority to those who are present. Okay.
See, you've befuddled them again.
Or befuzzified them.
Yeah, that's it.
All right.
Is this, no, I don't think this is a simple. No, that's not, no, this
Okay.
requires
All
half
right.
an hour.
Okay, in that case, then we will close it now.
Well, we could mention one of the anti-Semitic
Well,
things
no.
that we hear and what,
Oh, yeah, we could do that. And then I was going to do a PS of something we did several months
oh,
ago.
well then,
But
if
that-
it's a short, but look how
yes,
long that
no,
is, it's a whole
that's-
page long.
That's, we won't do
I'm just here to make sure this, he does not continue on and on.
So
forever and ever.
she is here to make sure that there is order.
No,
Since we're
not
talking about-
order. No, I'm not saying order. I'm saying cut off the length. I haven't all. We'll see if we met all night. Of course, I have to take a
Shavuot.
break from the all-night study and Shavuot. Yeah, the all-night study. But so while you're getting together, so ironically, so we're talking about this is taking place about a couple weeks before Shavuot, the spring holiday, and it is a custom on this holiday that Christians usually call Pentecost. It's a custom to study Torah or study Scripture all night long, and people do that. They have teenage groups get together and they study by flashlight outside. It's pretty cool way of commemorating the holiday in the spring, which very few congregations really do very much with at all. I'm going to be speaking as part of every hour on that night of the June 12th. There'll be a new speaker. The union is sponsoring this Zoom, I don't want to say a Zoom call, a Zoom extravaganza where every
Experience.
hour a new person speaks. And it goes, I found out today as I reread the instructions, from 7 p.m. on June 12th to 5 in the morning of June 13th. So that's a long time, and there's a lot of us speaking. And are we free to speak on whatever we want to, on whatever the Lord leads us? No, and no. We all have to speak on Ruth. I don't even know how many. 12 of us have to
No, I think
speak on Ruth.
8 or 10. Maybe.
8 or 10. Ruth is how many chapters long? 4. And how many people of us are speaking on it? So we've been apportioned, and I get, here's my passage, Ruth 2, verses 1 through 9. Not a lot happens. Not a lot happens in those 9 verses. So the guy says, the head of it says, do you have any preferred area of Ruth? I said, oh, an hour? You're giving me an hour? I can do the whole book of Ruth. I don't think that's what he wanted to hear at all. I said, well, you're going to have a lot of repetition between all these speakers. So, yeah, this is the way my life goes. But anyway, now you've
Okay,
gotten it together.
Now, I don't know. You look through these questions as well while I add this.
Okay.
Just so you know, and she may slug me for saying this. Patrice did the commentary
I'm prepped and ready.
on the Book of Ruth, and did the translation of the Book of Ruth on the Book of Ruth in the Messianic Jewish Study Bible. She did the translation of the Book of Ruth in the Tree of Life edition. So she is qualified to speak on this matter. And besides, her Hebrew name is Tamar Bat Ruth. Her mother's name was Ruth.
Yes. I didn't have to bop you with this book. So
I wasn't
that's
sure.
good. Yes, dear. What did
You were supposed to look through those while I was extolling your virtues.
Okay, what this is, and I've said we should have been doing this for about a year now. We have a list here of from a group called Jew Belong, JEWBELONG, and Jew Belong. You can go there online. I think it's Jew Belong, JEWBELONG.com, and it's a website designed for people, Jews or Gentiles, but I think mainly aimed at Gentiles who don't know a lot about Judaism, but who want to learn more about Judaism, and who want answers to questions. But funny enough about that, a lot of Jewish people learn stuff there too, because everybody's Jewish upbringing only concentrated on their family's upbringing, and they don't get the whole wide range of everything about Judaism. And so this website I think, is really handy and very almost entertaining to read. And so it gave us, I believe, this is called the Jew Belong Cheat Sheet. The Jew Belong Cheat Sheet came out, I would say, at least 2, if not 3 years ago. I don't know, we don't have page 3. We printed this out in 2023. But it just has, notice the format, number 1, number 2, number 3, and it's short little things after each one. And in this list, it gives you facts that when random people who, sort of are blowhards and don't know what they're talking about, make these statements about Jews and Judaism that are just totally
And Israel.
that's included, totally off the rails, wrong, misconception. It gives you facts that you can easily look at. Oh, that's covered under number 7. It talks about that. So what I had recommended to John was every week we should give you one of these numbered facts. I think there's might be 15 of them. No, but this is only page 2 out of 3. Is there only 10?
I think
Okay.
we stopped.
But each of these 10 is sort of like a wowza thing that everybody learns from. And so I had said we should do one every time we have this. Just take one of the numbers, read it, and then have a discussion about that. Because I think people are hungry for what they can say when people say stupid things about Israel or stupid things about Jews or whatever stupid thing they're passing around on the internet lately.
And I might add that this was put together in February of 2023.
So long time before October 7th.
That's exactly where I was going. A long time before October 7th, and some of these things become even more relevant since then. We have dealt with the first 2 because I got check marks beside them.
Oh, okay. Yeah, all right. Well, I would just repeat the basic tenet of both 1 and 2 for people who didn't happen to see that episode.
Okay. And yes, because the answer to some of these others is based on being a Zionist. And there's a whole lot of people who are anti-Zionists and consider themselves anti-Zionists and think we should all be anti-Zionists because they don't like either what Israel is doing or what the present government of Israel is doing.
Or they've been taught stupid things at various points in their lives about what Zionism is.
Okay. Being a Zionist means you stand for a safe and secure Israel, period. If you don't agree with all of Israel's policies, that's okay, but that's a different conversation. So if you are an anti-Zionist and you understand what the term means, that means that you are arguing for the destruction and desolation of Israel, to dismantle it, take it apart.
Or you misunderstand what Zionism is, because now, current time, Zionism is labeled as a white man's colonizing belief that white people can come and take over the ancient land that was known as Israel. And once again, that is not what Zionism, it says, in the least. Okay, that was summary of number 1.
Number 2, Jews comprise only 1.8% of the population of the United States, but are targets of 60% of the religious hate of religious hate crimes.
And I would think that proportion has gone way up since a year and a half ago. I quoted some numbers the other night.
This is only. Oh, yeah.
We already went through February 2024, so this is a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
Anyway, but where did I get those numbers that I brought up the other night and gave in the service? I should, hopefully I have them written down somewhere, slightly different than this. So Jews comprise 1.8% of the population in the U.S., but I know what it was. So what population of the world do Jewish people have? This is not just the U.S., but the whole world, and it was 0.2% of the world population. Not 1% of the world population. 0.2% of the world's population are Jewish, and yet, we cause mainly all the problems.
And we rule the world.
I guess so, yes. Never worked for me, but.
Or at least United States. And unfortunately, without naming names or getting political, I'm going to be semi-political, there are people within the political parties of the United States, and there are even a couple in government at some level or other, federal government, who have said, or at least alluded to the fact that the Jewish people are in control of either media or money or politics, or all three. And if you're interested in knowing which ones, I'll be happy to quote names, but we don't do that publicly.
See him privately.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember if it was the FBI statistics or Anti-Defamation League statistics, probably one building on the other, that there was, in the fall, a 300% increase in the number of Jewish hate crimes against Jews. Greater than 300%.
Well, even our congregation personally, when we were in high holidays,
Rosh Hashanah.
there was in Rosh Hashanah, during a Rosh Hashanah service, we had to evacuate the building because the police had a report that there was a bomb in our building. And so that really just happened this last fall. That was way before October 7th. Way before October 7th this happened. And I think a lot of people will be able to shake their heads and go, yeah, that was weird. That was a very, very. Our grandchildren were here. It was Rosh Hashanah, and so everybody was here. New Year, and including all the kids, and so they got to experience this too.
All right, now I'm going to jump to number 4 because it builds on what we just said.
Sure.
The Anti-Defamation League reports that there was a 34% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the United States from 2020 to 2021.
34% increase during that time.
During that time. And then it was a greater increase in 22. And then and also greater increase in 23. But by the fall of 23, the year hadn't ended, already in October and November, there was a 300% increase in anti-Semitic incidents. Okay. 3. For white supremacists, Jews are not white. Let me pause there. People don't understand this. And the bulk of people who walk the streets today probably don't understand this either. But when I was growing up, which granted was several decades ago, when I was growing up in school, we were not considered white. When you took it, fill out a survey or questionnaire, are you black, Hispanic, white, Jewish? So some of that has, in fact,
that was in the 1950s, I should say.
Yes, diminished since then, but not so among white supremacists. Or let me be very clear about this. White nationalists. Mm-hmm. They've simply changed the term to make it more palatable.
Yeah, and so when you read in today's, headlines or that you have white nationalists, are feeling their oats and they're just speaking out and having marches and everything. I think Americans usually consider they're against blacks. Yeah, they are against blacks. But underneath it all, the basis of it all was they're against Jews. And because the blacks are related to Jews, they're against Jews. And that is their focus more than black people. Unbelievable. However, it should be said, and this is still true in Eastern Europe, if you go and spend any time in an Eastern European country, in other words, the former Soviet Union, you can go for days and days and days and never see one black person. When John and I were in Poland for several days, and we visited in churches because we were doing Passovers to educate the Christians. And I'll never forget, as we're getting ready to fly home, we're sitting in the airport lobby. A black man walked through, and I went, look, a black person. So when you have racial ideas coming out of especially Eastern Europe, blacks, they don't see from day to day. John's parents had never seen a black person until they got on the ship that brought them to America. Had never seen one. Even today, as I said, in Poland, you can go for days and weeks and never see a black person, something you cannot see, say, in America at all anymore. Then you can understand why very, very tan people would stick out to them and they would label them as another race. And I think that's where the anti-Jewish thing stems from, the other races. It's not because they didn't have a viewpoint of black people. They had a viewpoint of Jews are not in our race. But for Americans to forget that it's all based on the anti-Jewish thing, the anti-black thing is based on the anti-Jewish thing, I think we need to, re-educate and point that out. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, now let me add something here before we get to the second part of this, because this is intentionally two-parted.
Yeah.
And then we'll conclude. Just so you know how real and relevant this is, 2017, Charlottesville. There was a huge reaction to certain statues being taken down or being removed. And as people marched through the streets, I think it was on that Friday night of that weekend, they were marching through the streets with torches lit, and they were shouting, and I quote, and you can find the videos for this, "Jews shall not replace us. Jews shall not replace us." And they were wearing Nazi t-shirts, some of which either had the emblem on it or quotations of Hitler's Mein Kampf as they were marching this. These were Americans in 2017, and they still exist. So this is all part of what we call white nationalists. It can get even worse. Yeah, I'm going to say this. My cousin, who happens to be a year older than our son, is an FBI agent. And he happened to be the FBI agent who was responsible for bringing in, arresting, one of those, what should we say it?
January 6th.
Yeah, one of the January 6th combatants, for lack of a better way to put it. And the one he happened to be bringing in, and he was assigned this because the FBI people knew that he came from, he's a practicing Catholic, but he comes from a Jewish background, if he's a cousin. He brought in one of the chief perpetrators there, and I saw this guy before my cousin brought him in, and his t-shirt said 6MNE. And so what's that? Well, it's a standard t-shirt for 6 million are not enough. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, think about it for just a second. That's related to the Holocaust and the 6 million Jews. 6 million are not enough. So that's a reality. That one goes back to, 2021, when my cousin Paul.
So he was sent out to arrest this guy, and he did.
My cousin Paul was the one who actually arrested him and brought him into court. Okay. All right, so white nationalists. So they hate us. For anti-Zionists, we're white colonialists. Okay, so white nationalists say Jews are not white, so they hate us. Anti-Zionists say we are white colonialists, so they hate us. So we can't get it coming and going. And then this raises a question which you don't have time to get into, but be happy to do so, but it will provide me for another commercial. how do you colonize a place you've lived in for 3,000 years?
But see, they're not told that. They assume that all the Jews in the Holy Land came after World War II. That's what they assume,
Yeah.
because they don't know the history of the region at all.
Yeah. So rightly they say, how do you colonize a place you've been living for 3,000 years? And actually, if for those of you here last night, you'll remember I mentioned Yom HaAliyah in its modern rendition since 2016, not the Ascension Day that we've celebrated. Where was I going with that?
People coming back to the land?
Yes, was a memorial for those who originally came back into the land.
Well, I think the number. Yeah, go ahead.
In the years just prior to 1948 and 1940, and the year 1947 and 48 when Israel became a state.
I think the bottom line for everything should be what you often say, which is there have always been Jewish people living in that geographical area. There have always been as many Jewish people living in that area as the government of the time would allow. So it's never been without Jewish people. In fact, there's been a big proportion of Jewish people living there, even though it was controlled by what's now the Turkish Empire. We would call it Turkish Empire, but it called the I can't think of the name it was always called before it became the Ottoman Empire. There were always Jews living there, always. And there were big waves of immigration, voluntary immigration of Jews since the 1850s, 1860s. Earlier than that? I just think of the big mob in the late 1800s, yeah?
Yeah, there's a large group in 1880s, but already in the 1840s, the Jewish people made up the plurality of the city of Jerusalem. Not the majority, but the plurality. That means that there were a variety of different groups there, and they were the largest of the groups.
And they started purchasing land outside of Jerusalem to make their kibbutzim, to make their farms.
Yeah.
Because that was, Jewish people were not allowed to own land in most of the rest of the year. And so when they came to this particular place, one of the first things they did when they got enough money was buy land. And so they bought land from people because the Ottoman Empire didn't give a rat's behind for that area of their territory. They just didn't care who lived there.
But more on that when we deal with this question later. Those are the kind of things we will deal with as we expand on that in the historical realities. What I wanted to say about Yom HaAliyah, it was set up to commemorate the day that the Jewish people first came into the land after the Exodus. If you take what I would say, and this is a whole other discussion, the earlier date for the arrival of the people in the land, then we're talking about not being in the land for 3,000 years, but for being in the land 3,400 years. That's how long we've been in the land consecutively. Now remember, we were there 400 years before and then ended up in Egypt. But if you're talking about continuously from the time of Joshua on, we're talking about 3,400 years. So we're not new to the land. Okay, more on that kind of stuff when we page through some of the rest of this.
Yeah. These little numbered things are really, really, it's a nice list because, once again, it's been a year and a half since that was printed, and it's more relevant today than it was when it was printed.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any questions on any of those things that we just floated up in the air out of nowhere? No? Okay.
Not out of nowhere.
That's right. It's not out of nowhere. It's out of this nice blue folder. Okay. Before we conclude in prayer, our next scheduled Stump the Stars is June 15th, 2 weeks from tonight. At least that's what the calendar on the bulletin board over there says, and I checked it before I sat down. So let's assume that was correct.
Let's assume that. I'm getting out my calendar if you're wondering what I'm doing. Go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to ask you to close in prayer.
Okay.
But you're getting out your calendar.
Yeah, I am. To make sure I have it written down in my yeah, I have it down
Okay.
on the 15th.
Okay,
Okay.
that was good. Oh, and since you got it, when is your Hebrew class?
My Hebrew class
The
is
18th.
the 18th. Okay,
Okay.
I have a little bit of time then.
Okay.
I thought it was like before that. So the first Hebrew review class is going to be June 18th. All right. Shall
Okay.
we pray?
Yes.
Okay. Avinu Malchenu, our Father and our King, we thank you and praise you that we've been able to come together tonight. Then we've been able to think about you. Then we've been able to look into certain aspects of your word. And we thank you for giving us knowledge, for providing us scriptures and the history that we can draw from. And we pray that it would help us walk forward in confidence as we learn more things. Maybe we be more confident as we walk together with you and follow in your footsteps. Keep us always learning and studying. Thank you. In Yeshua's name, amen.
Amen. And thank you all for joining us. You, and those who join us later, we're grateful for you.